Hello, my dudes. It is I, Serpent of Holy Skies, and here we are today with a review of the new Illusion Force album, The World Soul. So, Illusion Force are a fairly newer band, and this is, in fact, their debut album, and at that, it is some very high quality J Power. So, the band consists of brothers George and Yuya Shiromaru on guitars, Jin on vocals, Ollie Bernstein on bass, and Gensui on drums, and they've been active since sometime in 2018, if I recall correctly. Also, hopefully I didn't mispronounce any of those names. Sorry if I did, but yeah, fairly new band with some slightly lesser known artists at that, but you would hardly know it listening to them as they sound like quite a tight-knit professional power metal act. This is their first official effort and their first full release, and as far as melodic J-Power goes, this thing is definitely quite up there. I will note preemptively that this is also a concept album, which means spicy thematics and all that, so the whole concept behind the album is basically about a utopian world where the leading AI behind everything suddenly goes against humanity, so yeah, another one of those classic tales. Set somewhere in the distant 2000s, the artificial intelligence known as Mornia basically rules over the world as it is so advanced that it has pretty much united and developed humanity to the point of total equality and peace and all that. So yeah, cool techno utopia. The caveat being that Mornia eventually advances itself to the point where it deems that humanity as a whole is unnecessary. And then we've got the classic resistance force fighting this big bad AI. So yeah, the album follows that journey, although I can't say I've gleaned a lot of it, more than that short synopsis there, considering the lyrics haven't been released or anything so far as I am aware, but either way, it's definitely a really cool time as you'd expect, and aesthetically the album does match it nicely in a few various ways. Lyricism aside, there are a few cool futuristic-y sounds used throughout this thing, and used to build a pretty cool atmosphere at that, which is quite a fun time. So, getting into the band themselves, as mentioned, these guys work very well together, considering this is in fact their first release, and that's definitely in part due to how talented they are all individually. All of the performances on this album are not only pretty technically impressive, they all sound quite great and work well in tandem with each other. The guitar work on here is definitely one of the most impressive aspects, with a really great display of technical skill from the both of them, and furthermore, the interplay between the two guitars is definitely a feature used quite well in the album here, especially on the solo parts where they'll trade off with each other quite synergistically. Which I'd probably assume has something to do with the fact that the two of them are brothers and have been doing this before, but nonetheless, it is a very enjoyable experience. As far as bass goes on here, there are some surprisingly more impressive moments as well, which certainly isn't something you get too often from melodic power metal, but there are indeed some cool, unique bass parts throughout this which definitely stand out nicely. Plus, though I didn't mention this, the tone for the guitars and the bass on here is pretty appreciable. Vocally, this release is also quite impressive. Jin has a very impressive range, and his tone is reasonably versatile too, as it can be very driving and surprisingly intense when needed, and much more serene and melodic at other times. Either way, he's super emotive, which is great, and his vocals are always quite fun to experience on here. And last but certainly not least, the percussion on here is definitely quite a good time, constantly quite intense and driving, and furthermore, with some relatively cool fills throughout this thing too. In any case, the performance on the drums here is certainly quite an impressive time, and naturally all these individual parts are only strengthened when they are brought together on this thing. As mentioned, the band really does have some great synergy together here, and of course with such quality musicianship, the album certainly has the songwriting to back it. So, the songwriting on this album is definitely another one of its strong points, and at that I'd probably say the strongest aspect of the album too, although it does tend to follow a more straightforward style as far as the song structures go. Those that do take this route are extremely efficient with it, and there is occasionally a bit of variety throughout the song structures as well, some progression here and there which is certainly quite welcomed. Overall, though, as apparent with the predominantly more easy-to-follow song structures, the main focus of the music on this album is definitely catchiness and melody. All of the melodies on this album are very much in your more upbeat and catchy vein of things, ranging between happy, motivational, and driving feels. Overall, they tend to have a much more poppy leaning to them, I guess you would say, though there is quite a bit of intensity in a lot of the more fast-paced sections as well. As you'd expect, the melodic ground on here is covered primarily by the vocals and guitar lines, though some of the symphonic-esque synth sections as well as the piano bits definitely help with the melodic leanings on here as well. As far as the vocal melodies and the guitar lines go, though, they're all written extremely well, working very well in tandem with one another. All the riffs on here tend to be pretty damn catchy, even if half of them are more so backing riffs. They tend to all work very well with the other melodies around them, and again are pretty catchy on their own. And when they are more focused riffs, they are very, very fun to listen to. And as mentioned, there can be a surprising amount of intensity in that regard, as this album does have a lot of faster, more driving sections. As far as the rhythm section goes on this thing, the bass and percussion definitely put in some great work too. With the speedier sections, they propel everything quite impressively, with the drums keeping quite a blistering pace and having some pretty cool drum lines and fills throughout such sections. And of course, there are an abundance of pretty quality fills throughout the whole album, so percussion is definitely up to par on here. As for bass, which is usually a little less focused on in power metal, there is also more here than just your average chugging or mirroring guitar lines. You've got some relatively interesting bass lines throughout some of the songs on here, which are quite spicy, and the rhythms played otherwise definitely blend very well with the rest of the songwriting and can be fairly interesting on their own. Touching back on the synthier parts of the album as well, their usage definitely helps give this thing more of an anthemic and grandiose atmosphere when necessary, which is quite a cool time. All of them are definitely written and used quite well. Furthermore, I do feel some neoclassical influence on both them and the songwriting in general at times, which does also play a bit into the more serene piano bits that show up here and there on this thing. So yeah, definitely an appreciable time. Songwriting is overall quite amazingly done on here. Touching back on the atmosphere as well, it's certainly another cool part about this thing. You've got that whole kind of semi-theatrical, anthemic feel that the symphonic bits add to everything, which is of course helped by the vocal layering, which does make everything feel a lot more majestic and impressive. There's definitely quite a bold sound to this thing overall, and with how happy and catchy the melodies are, it certainly works extremely well, especially when it comes to espousing emotion. As mentioned, this album does a great job with invoking tons of happier and more motivational feels. Lots of the melodies on here, as well as the overall driving, faster sections and the grandiose atmosphere, combine very well to give off some really inspirational and positive emotions in general. Though, of course, there is a bit of variety to this throughout each song. For instance, a lot of the more piano-focused sections are quite calming and beautiful. Either way, the overarching use of atmosphere and the emotions invoked on this thing are handled super well, so that's certainly another point in the band's favor. It really does elicit such an inspirational and motivational feeling that can only really be achieved at the peak of power metal, in my opinion. And on top of that, the slightly more unique atmosphere this thing has when combining the more straightforward melodic nature of J-Power with the more grandiose feels that it brings to the table really does make for something quite great. As far as production goes, I'd say it's overall pretty well done. My only major complaints being I think that percussion and the synthier aspects on here are a bit louder than they should be, as the main melody lines are a little bit less clear in some instances due to them. I'd also say the bass is a little bit less audible than I would like it to be as well, since even on the unique bass lines it's a little bit tougher to hear them with everything else going on. Everything else about the production, though, is pretty good in my opinion. The sound is nice and clear and translates all of the melodic edge and energy pretty perfectly, whilst retaining a little bit of heaviness and intensity for the more fast-paced sections on here as well. Overall, everything sounds really good. Again, my only big issue is the balancing. As for the individual tracks themselves, this thing has plenty of standout moments as well. So yeah, quick track-by-track section upcoming. If you find those tedious, or if you simply want to experience them first for yourself and you haven't listened to the album yet, then feel free to hit the timestamp and skip ahead to my closing thoughts. If you aren't restrained in such a manner, however, then here we go. The opener, Eastern Wisdom, is a pretty straightforward opening track. You've got the atmospheric intro, which plays a few cool, more futuristic-y sounds, backed by symphonics to set the concept and mood of the album in place. A nice little melody, which will show up later, then plays on what seems to be a traditional Eastern folk instrument, which is pretty cool, with more backing orchestral, eventually leading into the first full track, Machination Utopia. With a very energetic and grandiose intro, this thing shifts into a pretty fast-paced yet comfortable track, with some really catchy melodies and a very pleasant atmosphere overall. The little piano additions on this thing add another layer of beauty to it, which is really nice. The track really is just trying to push across such a pure and good feeling, which is fitting since at this point in the story it's basically introducing you to the utopian world. All in all, definitely one of the more memorable tracks. Love the melodies on this thing, and it's super pleasant overall. The next track, The Coming Tragedy, is a bit more intense and more in the fast-paced vein of power metal. Overall, some very memorable riffing, some slightly more varied and intense vocals, which are definitely quite cool, and the solo on here in particular is super spicy. So yeah, definitely one of the better tracks as well, even if it's a little bit less memorable than the first overall. The Force of Illusion is our next track on here, and probably has one of my favorite parts on the entire album. The song has a much less straightforward structure with lots of variety overall, which is pretty cool, and is fairly intense and up-tempo throughout. There's overall some really catchy and impressive riffing, plus some really impressive and catchy vocal lines on here too. It's very easy to get the part stuck in your head. Plus, the bridge on here is quite an interesting little bit, which makes really good use of the symphonics and other varied instrumentation. Another great track for sure. Time Will Tell is the next track and is actually a ballad. The first one on here, and at that, definitely the best, I would say. Very beautiful and calming acoustic track with some really pretty and emotional melodies, aided by some great symphonics on here. It also incorporates those sci-fi-esque sounds that were used in the intro track, so that's some pretty cool recurrence. Plus some good use of electric guitar later in with a very nice emotive solo. But yeah, the vocals, acoustics, and symphonics on this thing are all straight up beautiful. Another easy favorite track and an amazing ballad. Then we get another extremely catchy track that is arguably one of the best on the album, also known as I'll Be Your Hero, which definitely has one of the catchiest, if not the catchiest choruses on the whole album. Very fast-paced and some great intensity throughout. Beautiful atmosphere, especially with the intro build-up. Great riffs, amazing melodies. Literally nothing not to like about this song. Definitely one of the most inspirational songs on the entire thing, and possibly one of my favorites. Followed up by, believe it or not, another amazing track, Our Vision, which is quite possibly the most upbeat and happy song on this entire thing as well. Furthermore, it goes surprisingly hard for something so incredibly uplifting, as the verses on here are super intense with some driving riffs and percussion. Vocals as well are pretty fast-paced on here until we hit the choruses, which are just anthemically beautiful in nature. Very catchy and very motivational and quite impressive as well. Very spicy solos on this thing too, including a bass solo, which is really appreciable. So yeah, lovely track. Another easy contender for one of my favorites, I'd say. Also, for a little recap, pretty sure the story so far at this point is mostly the AI going, "Begone, humanity," and then some boys making a resistance force and all. So yeah, good times there. The next song, The End of Days, does seem to be from the perspective of the AI and does have a bit of a darker tone. It's also overall more of a mid-tempo track and a little bit more riff-based as well. Some really cool bass and piano usage on this track especially, some very nice variety in general actually, since they do bring back that more traditional folk instrumentation, and the vocals on the chorus are great and quite catchy at that. As with the verses where Jin screams, since that line is quite ominous and quite cool in general. Also, this thing has a really great solo. But yeah, quality track, nice spookier tone to it, and all despite blending in with the rest of the album quite well. So cool stuff for sure there. Then we get Glorious March, which is exactly as the title suggests. Very grandiose track with quite a majestic feel overall, very anthemic, more up-tempo stuff, really motivational and driving feels overall. In addition, it also has that one melody from the intro track that we heard, so that's really cool. And some of the best vocal moments on here. Some really great intensity on the vocals on this track, and the parts where Jin screams is super catchy. Plus the use of backing vocals on here is really nice. Super catchy chorus too, and some consistently spicy guitar leads and choruses. There is also some good variety on here, nice use of piano, and everything just accumulates to quite the majestic track. Not to mention the vocals towards the very end are just straight up beautiful. Definitely one of the most energetic songs on here, and easily one of the best in my opinion. Final Destination is more of a mid-tempo track and enters with quite an anthemic intro before bleeding into a very ballady section, which is super beautiful, with some excellent use of strings, and the vocals slowly ramp up as the more intense instrumentation heads in. Whilst there aren't many particular melodies on this thing that are super standout, the track as a whole is a really fun listening experience, especially thanks to the nice variety on it and those slower, more serene sections. Also, the neoclassical feel is a bit more palpable on this track, which is quite a fun time for sure. Great use of both piano and symphonic portions, and the guitar solos as well as the keyboard solo on here are pretty spicy for sure. Now, for the title track here, honestly, I can't help but think of an anime opening for this one. You've got that piano bit which persists throughout the song for the intro, which builds up the other instruments and vocals, and the melodies are all just super J-power and J-rock feeling, plus there are a bunch of small little variations in the instrumentations throughout the verses before they hit the big grandiose chorus, which all of those little variations kind of feel like the smaller bits you'd hear accompanying character introductions or something of the like. So yeah, it just genuinely feels like a really well done anime intro song. It's a really good track, very nice upbeat atmosphere, and quite catchy, and of course all the variety is pretty cool, as is the piano line on this thing. So yeah, very fun track for sure. Salvation starts off with some really nice drum lines, and overall is a fairly driving track with a reasonably determined feel. Though I do feel it isn't too strong in the riff department compared to most of the other more up-tempo songs on here, it does have some nice melodies for sure, especially with some of the spicier guitar lines that occasionally grace this thing. The vocals are also quite catchy, as you'd come to expect at this point. Quite a nice chorus too, though overall I would say one of the less memorable songs on the album. Even then, it's still a super fun track with some great variety to it, and as mentioned, some great melodies. The Wish is the closing track on here, and is more or less a ballad. Nice mid-tempo, very sweet and uplifting song with quite a serene feel overall, extremely pretty and emotive guitar lines, and some really nice use of acoustics. Plus the vocals are super catchy and pretty beautiful on this track. Overall a really good closer to everything and a really uplifting song. So yeah, you can kind of tell this thing is extremely consistent in how good it is, which is both kind of comical since it makes it hard for me to pick a favorite song, but it definitely is a testament to how good the band is. And on that topic, if I did have to pick a favorite track, I'd probably go for either I'll Be Your Hero, Our Vision, or Glorious March. That more or less covers everything I have to say on this album. Overall, it is definitely in the higher tier of power metal, being able to channel all the beautiful melodic aspects of J-Power so well, and furthermore being able to invoke such inspiration, motivation, and joy. Truly some masterful songwriting on here, backed up by some amazing musicians to craft something that feels absolutely great to listen to, and sounds fairly unique in its delivery as well. It'd definitely be hard to conflate this band with others considering just how memorable the majority of their songwriting is. Especially those melodies. There are a few issues here and there. Whilst this thing is super consistent, I would definitely hesitate to say that every track is top tier, and again there are some issues with the production as mentioned earlier, but ultimately I don't have many complaints. Overall, I would rate this thing a 9 out of 10. Definitely recommend you go look into this if you haven't yet. Certainly one of the best albums out this year, and assuredly one that I will be coming back to quite a bit. And that is all for this review. Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed, then go ahead and leave a like or subscribe for similar content. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on either the review or the album itself, and yeah, I've got links down below to the band and album. Go support them if you like their work, and hope you have a wonderful day.